Hello and welcome to another Out of Spec Reviews video. I know we've had a lot of coverage so far between this channel and my dad's channel, Out of Spec Dave, all about Tesla Superchargers opening up to the public. But I've been following some responses on Twitter, of course, from our Rate Your Charge profile, and I've seen some confusion out there as to why some cars seemingly aren't charging as fast as you would expect. So I really wanted to target this video just on that particular topic. There's plenty more topics I think we can dig into about Tesla opening up their network in America. But there's two factors here. The first is high voltage cars, and the second is actually the power output of the superchargers, surprisingly, is an issue at the moment. So I wanted to talk about setting expectations for those of you who might be using the Tesla Supercharger network with your CCS equipped cars in North America. Talk about how it's actually a little bit different than Europe, and overall explain some limitations that I'm seeing out there right now. So no question, it's an exciting time to be in the EV charging space because the whole world is getting shaken up. At the moment, I think there's 10, 11, 12 stations, something like that have been opened from normal superchargers using the Tesla connector all the way to now using a CCS adapter built into the unit. If you go back to some of our previous videos, you'll see how it operates. My dad did a fantastic tour of his first charging session with his Genesis GV60 in Brewster, New York, and it was a pretty seamless experience. However, there were a lot of questions popping up in the comments there. So let me sort of set the stage with issue number one, and then we'll get into issue number two. So issue number one is high voltage cars using the Tesla Supercharger network. Right now there's version 2 and version 3 superchargers installed in the ground in North America. After watching the Tesla Investor Day video recording, it sounds like version 4 superchargers, which is the next generation. We don't know too much about version 4. Those are just starting to be installed, or at least in the very early phases in Europe. So as of now in North America, we only have version 2 and version 3. All the CCS equipped chargers at this time are only at version 3 sites. So we haven't seen a version 2 supercharger updated to work with CCS. What's the difference for those of you who may not know? We'll do other videos on our out of spec guide about that, but essentially version 2 is capped at 150 kilowatts. It's one cabinet, one 150 kilowatt cabinet feeding 2 posts. So you get 75-ish kilowatts if two cars are there, 150 if you're the only one, in very basic terms. And then if you have a version 3 supercharger, it goes up to 250 kilowatts per post output. The actual charger itself in the version 3 supercharger is about 370 kilowatts. But what Tesla does is pretty genius. They actually link together multiple chargers through a DC bus on the back end so they can, at the site level, move power around. And because Tesla vehicles don't hold peak charging rates that long, very rarely do you actually notice a power sharing derating at version 3s. I can count on one hand how many times I've actually noticed that the whole site was maxed out, everyone's pulling full power, and I was down to 150, 140 kilowatts because of it. And that only lasted for a short period of time. As soon as someone unplugged, boom, power levels came up. Another person unplugged, boom, it shot back up. So you can't get always full power at every post on a version 3, but because they can do a site level power flow distribution, you don't actually have to leave spaces between charging posts. It doesn't really matter. They can send power wherever they need to go. It's pretty genius. So let's talk a little bit about what that problem is as soon as we start thinking about 800 volt cars. And so that would be Lucid, that would be Taycan, e-tron GT, it would be Ioniq 5 EV6 and GV60, the eGMP cars. And I would say those are probably the most common 800 volt cars out there. And I'll leave the big question mark, which is the Hummer EV, towards the end of this discussion, because I actually don't know what's going to happen when someone plugs in a Hummer EV. It'll be really interesting to see how GM has tuned that product to interact with the supercharger limitations. And the Tesla Supercharger can only output a maximum of around 500 volts. And, for those of you, I know a lot of you guys don't necessarily understand volts, amps, watts. But the best way I can try and very briefly explain this to you, and we'll have a full in-depth, guide video on what the difference is. In order to actually charge an electric car, the charger needs to meet the battery pack voltage level that's in the car. And that cannot really change. That's dictated chemically by the battery cells in the car, the way that they're arranged, the state of charge of the vehicle. So let's just say you plug in a Tesla Model S Plaid. It's at about 420 volts, given a certain state of charge. The charger will say, hey, I got the communication when you first plugged in. You're at about 420 volts. I'll match the size of my pipe to your battery pack and we'll link together the voltage. And as that goes up as we charge, I will increase the size of the voltage on the charger and the car will also will be matching that. And you really want the voltage to be completely matched because you'll have inrush current. There's a whole bunch of other things, but essentially think of it as like you're hooking up two garden hoses. They have to have the same size connection. Otherwise, you'll have leakage and bad things will happen. So you got to match the voltage. So the car cannot actually change the battery pack's voltage, given some interesting things that GM does with the Hummer EV. And so really the only thing the charger can control, and it's honestly trying to meet the car's ask, is the current requirement, the amperage. So you plug in the Plaid, 420 volts, boom, locked in. You got that hose locked up. As soon as the car's like, okay, give me power now, the supercharger will say, great, I'm going to dump in, 600 amps, 650 amps, whatever you're looking for. And then you can multiply that 650 amps times the voltage, and that will give you your total power. So that's just a brief overview. And version 3 superchargers can output, I've seen close to 700 amps. I want to say 650 to 680 through that little tiny cable. It's crazy, but it's liquid cooled and it's pretty impressive. And so as soon as you start rolling up with a higher voltage car, let's just say a Lucid Air at about 850 volts, 880 volts, is very common on that car, because full charge, I think, is 920 on it. The size of that pipe on the supercharger can't get that big. So here you are with your big high voltage pipe essentially, and this is just a visualization. There's no relation to pipe size here. You're rolling up with a Lucid Air with a big pipe, and the supercharger can't get that big. Well, you're going to have obviously leakage, issues charging. It's not going to be possible. So 800 volt cars have something called an onboard booster. And the way the booster works is it actually will turn down or tell the charger it's a lower voltage, accept a lower voltage than the battery pack from the charger, and then essentially step up the voltage inside of the car. It's essentially a DC to DC converter built into the car, and each car has a different conversion strategy, and I'll go through the most common ones here. So for example, we'll start with a Taycan. The way the Taycan works, and out of the factory, it's a 50 kilowatt onboard booster. There is an optional 150 kilowatt booster that I highly encourage Taycan owners to spec now if you're getting your car, because the superchargers will take advantage of it. When you plug into a supercharger, what it's actually going to do is split the pack voltage in half. It's basically a 50% reduction in voltage is the way that it works. So when it plugs into the supercharger, it's going to say, hey, instead of 800 volts, really, let's just say 750, but instead of 800 volts, why don't you give me 400 volts? And here's how much current I want, probably 125 amps at 400 volts would be 50 kilowatts. And then inside the car, it will step that voltage up twice. It'll, basically go through its onboard DC to DC booster, charge the battery pack at twice the voltage and half the current inside. And there's some losses included. So a Taycan out of the box on the Tesla Supercharger network, because of that 50 kilowatt limitation, can only charge at 50 kilowatts on a Tesla Supercharger, because superchargers are really the only DC fast charging product in the US right now that don't go up to 1,000 volts or 800 volts. There's a few 50 kilowatt chargers out there, but that's not much of a limitation because they don't give that much power. Pretty much any high power charger in America is capable of 1,000 volts DC. In Europe, it's a little bit different, but we're talking about the US. And so that booster in the Taycan is going to be active every time you plug it into a Tesla Supercharger. Now, if you have a 150 kilowatt onboard booster in your Taycan, that's great. You will plug into the Tesla Supercharger and it's going to ask for more current to match that 150 kilowatts, or at least get close. And so basically that's what has to happen. The way the Lucid does it is it uses the Wonderbox, a DC to DC booster. And I'm not totally sure of the control strategy for Lucids, but 50 kilowatts is what the rumor is at the moment. I think they have 225 or 224 kilowatt DC boosters inside that Wonderbox. And so perhaps they'll have a change, a retrofit in future models to match the Superchargers. This, again, has not been an issue until Tesla opened up the Supercharger network for CCS cars, because our infrastructure, we don't really need boosters in the US. You can honestly get away without it until now is like, okay, you need a booster because you want your customers to charge on a reliable charging network. So Lucids are limited to 50 kilowatts is the rumor. I mean, it might be a little bit more, but we haven't seen one charge higher. And I don't think Lucid's ever officially or shared the onboard booster limitation. But based off of everything I can find, it's about 50 kilowatts. And some owners have helped me find that information. The Taycan is 50 kilowatts out of the box and 150 kilowatts as an optional extra. It's not a cheap option, but I would recommend getting it. It's like $1,500 or $1,200, something like that. And then you get the eGMP cars, the Hyundai Kia Genesis cars. Those are limited to 100 kilowatts, no extra option required, but they do something really interesting using an onboard booster. They essentially don't have a separate piece of equipment in the car responsible for this voltage, or I should say, twice the voltage, half the current, the DC to DC boosting. They use the rear motor's inverter. So from the charge port, rather than going through your charging electronics and straight into the battery, they actually have a different track that the energy takes. It runs into the inverter and essentially regens the battery pack at up to 100 kilowatts. And this is pretty genius stuff. Now, I believe they tell the chargers they want 450 volts is the communication, but it's actually variable. And with a lot of chargers are current limited, and I know I'm getting nerdy for a second, but a lot of chargers are current limited. So I'd encourage Hyundai Kia Genesis Group to actually issue a software update to dynamically adjust the voltage request based off of the charger's maximum. Now, that's sometimes a little bit difficult in the communication to find out, but you could always request, 500 volts. Most chargers can do that out there. And if for whatever reason you have a failed charging session right after that, you could derate down to a 450 volt request. But if you're doing, 100 amps, or I should say 200 amps through the rear inverter, be cool to do it at 500 volts instead of 450. Slightly more efficient, maybe a little bit more power. Could be kind of interesting to see. But that's really next level integration right there, because now you're using existing hardware in the car to boost up the power. Now, it is, it's still slow. It's 100 kilowatts. That car is capable on the 77 kilowatt hour battery pack of charging at 240 kilowatts when you have the power available to do it. So there are going to be some cars that will actually charge slower on the Tesla Supercharger network than the public networks out there. It's also slightly more expensive than most of the public networks out there. So I really think the key benefit of the Tesla Supercharger network opening up for these users is purely as peace of mind. It's a backup. So if you get to a EVgo or EA or ChargePoint station and it happens to be full or busy or not working in the way you want it to, hopefully there's a supercharger that's opened up that you just have that peace of mind in your back pocket where it's like, okay, if I have to go there, then great. That's at least you're not stranded. And 50 kilowatt charging, 100 kilowatt charging is not the end of the world. It's inconvenient, but not the end of the world. So to me, that's the real benefit of the Supercharger network opening up to those cars. But I at least wanted to explain why you're not going to see 250 kilowatts on those cars. Now, there's actually another reason at the moment why you won't see 250 kilowatts on any car at a Tesla Supercharger. I mean, that's using the CCS adapter. And it starts by going back a little bit. So that's problem number one. Problem number two here is the current output limitation of the Supercharger when using CCS. So let's back up. When Tesla first issued the CCS to Tesla adapter, that allows Teslas to charge on public networks. I use that all the time with my Plaid. That actual adapter is rated, a nameplate rated for 350 amps. Now, it's a passive adapter. There's really not many power electronics going on in there. There's maybe some thermistors to derate if things get hot, but essentially it's a dummy adapter, and it just is a way to connect wires to the Tesla plug. So when you plug the Model S Plaid, in my case, if I plug my Model S into a Delta 350 kilowatt EVgo station, The car's going to say, hey, I want 650 amps. I'm dead. I'm hot. Give me all the power you can. And the charger is going to say, hey, I can't quite do 650 amps, but I can do 540. That's the maximum output for those units right there. And so what essentially will happen is you're going to be pushing 540 amps through that CCS adapter that's nameplate rated for 350. Now, famously, we just charged at Atlas in Arizona last week, and we tried to fry a CCS cable, and we put, all the power through that adapter, and it's fine. There's no major issues, right? But that's just, one note to say is that adapter technically listed is rated for 350 amps, but you can push a bunch more through it. And because the Tesla is not sitting there for 3 hours, it just pulls max power for maybe 10 minutes, nothing seems to melt. And there's, again, probably some thermistors in there as safeguards. The next iteration, the next, flow of this is the reverse adapter going from the Tesla Supercharger to CCS is rated for 350 amps. Actually, the entire Supercharger dispenser post nameplate rated is for 350 amps. And I find that really interesting because when you plug in, again, a Model S to a Supercharger, you're getting 250 kilowatts at low pack voltage, which means well over 600 amps. So Tesla is just blowing past the nameplate current rating of that dispenser. And again, they operate the car, they operate the charger, they have temperature monitoring on the inlet side of the car. All of this communication can go back and forth. It's not dangerous. In fact, in my opinion, amperage limitations are kind of silly. It should all be temperature control based. Because as we talked about when we were at Atlas, you can flow as much current as you want through a little tiny cable, maybe not for a long time, but in theory, any cable can handle any current for, it's just for how long. And so with a liquid-cooled cable, Tesla Superchargers derate when the handles get hot. We've talked about that over the years. It's not dangerous in any way, at least the way Tesla is doing it here. So when you plug in your Tesla Supercharger with the CCS adapter, which is included the Magic Dock, and you plug that into a Rivian R1T that's low, as an example, the Rivian's going to say, hey, I want the 500 amps. From basically 0 to 40% roughly on the Rivian, assuming the battery is warm, it's going to ask for, you're going to start dead at around 180, 190 kilowatts. By the time you're just about to taper off the curve, as pack voltage comes up 430, 440 volts, you'll see 220, 221 kilowatts peak on a Rivian. Not on a Tesla Supercharger, because it seems that when you use the CCS adapter, Tesla is limiting the output of that dispenser to the nameplate 350 amp rating. I actually went on Twitter yesterday and said, anyone who can charge faster than 150 kilowatts on a Tesla Supercharger, tag me. And there were none. There were a couple Rivians that were doing 155, 157, and that's fine because, again, you're still at that 350 amp limitation, and their pack voltage is a little bit high in the Rivian, so that makes sense. But I'm not seeing the 180s, 190s, 200s that we should be seeing. If you plug in an iX, an i4, an EQS with the big battery, a Rivian, they should all request 500 amps at around 400 volts, and that would be 200 kilowatts. And in fact, almost all of those cars can do slightly more because their pack voltage is a little bit higher than 400 volts. And it really seems Tesla is limiting it to this 350 amp nameplate rating. Now, is that intentional? Is that just for testing purposes? Is that because they're no longer serving their own vehicles and they have to actually, legally for some electrical code maybe match the nameplate rating and can't do anything more? I'm not sure. And I also don't think it's that big of a deal. But what is interesting is when you load up the Tesla app as a non-Tesla user, it actually displays 250 kilowatts max. But no CCS car today would be able to do that. In theory, the most amount of power you could pull out of a Tesla Supercharger, again, if they're assuming their voltage is capped at 500 volts, which we totally believe it is because we're seeing Lucids and eGMP cars have to use their onboard boosters. So 500 volt maximum, 350 amp current maximum, you're going to be a maximum of 175 kilowatts, assuming, everything is perfect. And that's really not possible because no car is going to have a 500 volt battery pack. At least that's on the market right now. Maybe some commercial stuff, but no consumer grade vehicles would be able to max that out. And so I think it's interesting that they brand the charger still as 250 kilowatts on the CCS page. Now, it's possible in a day, in a week, in a year, they'll say, you know what, version 3 superchargers, we're going to ignore the nameplate rating and we are going to dump the current and go full send. And you know what, your Volvo EX90, that's a 400 volt system architecture that's manufacturer rated at 250 kilowatt charging speed, more than 500 amps, again, over 600. Then now we're talking like, okay, that's good. And I expect that to happen at some point in the future. I'm not sure why it didn't launch that way, especially considering Tesla wasn't concerned about the CCS to Tesla adapter accepting all of the juice through it. The Tesla to CCS adapter seemingly has to match that nameplate rating. And again, it could totally be an electrical code thing because they're not serving their own vehicles, their owned and operated vehicles, although they are individually owned cars. So let's get into the next just ending thoughts here. Version 4 superchargers, what's that going to mean? Well, it's going to mean longer cables, which is great. So Cablegate sounds like it's going to go away when there's more version 4 superchargers out there. I'm very much looking forward to that. And it also means 1,000 volt capable chargers and maybe even higher. So in those cases, you actually will get much higher speeds using the Magic Dock because you won't have to use the onboard boosters for these cars. So the big question is, how many version 3 versus version 4 superchargers are going to be retrofitted? I sort of hope that every version 4 supercharger is CCS capable. Open this thing up. Let's rock and roll. But we'll have to wait and see. At the end of the day, I think right now the version 3 is, again, a fantastic backup solution for 800 volt cars, for 400 volt cars that request a lot of current, looking at Rivian, iX, EQE, EQS, etc. It's a fast but not fastest charging solution. And I still would recommend finding, in those cases, you actually need to use a 350 kilowatt, branded charger out in the public because they request 500 amps. And then, if you have an Audi e-tron, if you have a Bolt, if you have, a Kia Niro or a Kona, the supercharger can provide all the power to your vehicle that it can accept. So again, some cars will have a speed disadvantage. Some cars that are a little bit slower charging, no issues at all charging on the supercharger network. And that's what we're finding today. The last point I want to leave you on, and I really hope some of you try this out, is for our viewers who drive Hummer EV. When you plug a Hummer EV into an 800 volt capable charger or 1,000 volt capable charger, the pack basically goes from 350 volts nominal to about 700 volts nominal. It's not quite 800. It's pretty low voltage. And that allows, 500 amps at higher voltage, of course, the 361 kilowatts we've been able to pull out of it. And so that's pretty cool. They basically are a double stacked battery pack, and they switch from parallel to series, doubling the voltage, essentially allowing it to charge faster. When it plugs into a supercharger, it's going to have to not disconnect the battery packs, right? It's going to have to keep them in parallel because it needs the lower voltage to charge on the version 3 supercharger. But how much current will it request? We don't know. I have no clue. It's possible if Tesla opens up the supercharger network, it'll say, give me everything, and we'll see 250 kilowatt charging on the Hummer EV. We know the battery pack can take it. I don't know if the car's rated to handle more than 500 amps, but I feel like that thing is so hell yeah America. There's no amperage limitation in there at all. It's just going to get all the juice the charger can give it. So that'll be really interesting to see what happens, especially after hopefully Tesla removes the 350 amp limitation. Just a little nerd thought that I've been pondering the last few days. And of course, if no one tests it soon, I'll grab a Hummer EV and I'll try it out in New York. So I can't thank you enough for watching this video. I know it's a little bit of a long explanation, but I hope this helps 800 volt users understand how their cars will operate with the Tesla charging network. I still can't figure out for the life of me why Tesla in the CCS app lists them as 250 kilowatts, because in Europe they actually do the full 500 amps using the CCS cable. So there's no limitation in Europe for this at all. There's still the higher voltage problem where you have to use the boosters. Every time I charge a Taycan in Europe on a Tesla Supercharger, I never get more than 150 kilowatts because most of the Taycans over there have the enhanced booster. And, that's fine, but it's not the 270 I'd get if I go to an Alpitronic unit, nearby. And so basically, yeah, I hope this helps you guys understand a little bit about the voltage problems. Thank you so much for watching another Out of Spec Reviews video. Sorry for just sitting in my couch and we're not out testing cars, but I've seen a lot of questions about this. So see you on another one soon. Bye-bye.